This week, we're focusing on the first few decades of the 20th century. Despite these events happening around a century ago, they still impact our world today. Xenophobia and nationalism are still widespread and mainstream, creating immigration laws and attitudes about immigration that are still around today. During this time, there was also a rise in eugenics as well as the women's suffrage movement, which is now referred to as first-wave feminism. Technology also had advanced to the point where motion pictures were popular and used for entertainment and propaganda purposes. It might seem so distant from today, but the first several decades of the 20th century created ideologies and technologies that still impact us today, better or worse. By the beginning of the 1900s, immigration to the US had not stopped. In fact, it was increasing as people from Eastern and Southern Europe began to immigrate in large numbers. But despite these populations being considered white, they weren't the right kind of white. Xenophobia was still going strong and influencing laws that governed who could come into the country. A small group of influential men in Boston formed the Immigration Restriction League, the IRL, in 1894. The IRL worked for 27 years to ensure the right populations were allowed to enter the U.S., keeping the country and the race pure. Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian populations were still banned from entering, along with lunatics, polygamists, and anarchists. Southern and Eastern European populations were considered marginally better than blacks, indigenous, and Asians, who were all ranked at the bottom of the constructed racial hierarchy. While people who were Southern and Eastern European were white, they weren't white enough. So the amount of immigrants from those parts of Europe were highly restricted through World War II. Science at the time said there were multiple white races instead of just one. There were those from Northern and Western Europe, Slavs, Hebrews, Mediterraneans, and Alpines. The races that weren't Northern and Western European were considered inferior. Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, and other Northwestern Europeans were welcome with open arms because they were white. This xenophobia had become part of U.S. culture by the 1920s, with most Americans supporting these immigration restrictions and discriminating against the few immigrants that were allowed into the country. So much so that immigration acts were passed in 1917, 1921, and 1924, continually restricting immigration so much that very few people were entering the U.S. from Europe. As Kelkar's article and Brodkin's chapter both address, there never really was a concrete definition of what makes someone white or not at any given point in history. That's because there is no definition, legally or otherwise. Today, we base it more on how someone appears than anything else. The Wikipedia page, Definitions of Whiteness in the United States, has a long list of legal cases starting in 1817 and going through 1944 about who is and is not white. If you look at the list, you'll see the cases end up contradicting each other at times. Syrians, Asian Indians, and Arabs are all both white and not white depending on the case. There are even cases determining what race someone who is biracial is, which is interesting because hegemonic thought has reduced being biracial to one identity. Thanks to things like the one-drop rule, having a direct relative that is not white makes someone that racial group. And then there are biracial or multiracial people who have no white ancestors. Someone can have a black parent and an Asian parent, but not necessarily be seen as biracial. Former Vice President Kamala Harris is an example of this. She has one parent who's black and another who's Indian. If she wasn't so open about her parents, she might have been called black or Indian instead of being both. As we've talked about throughout this course, racial categories are dangerous because they erase the diversity contained within and reduce people to one identity when there are multiple identities involved. Unfortunately, the U.S. keeps using the legal system to define race and privilege certain racial identities over others. By the early 20th century, Mexicans had gone from a desired working force to another immigration population to be dealt with. Mexicans were encouraged to come to the U.S. and work here, so much so that crossing the border was not an issue. There was no legal or illegal border crossing at that point. Mexicans would freely cross for work and then return to Mexico after the season was done or their contract was up. But by the early 1900s, segregation in the Southwest started to resemble the segregation in the South, except that it was used to keep Mexicans separate from whites, including schools, stores, neighborhoods, and restaurants. And this discrimination extended to Mexican Americans, both those who became U.S. citizens when the border was redrawn and those born here and were citizens. Social and legal obstacles were built up to make them just as disenfranchised as those who recently came to the U.S. Being part of a family that was living in that place before it became part of the U.S. didn't matter anymore. They were seen as Mexicans and treated as such. People soon realized that enough laws had been put in place to close the doors to both European and Asian countries, but the southern border was still a way for people to enter the country. But there were challenges to closing that border that were not there for the other groups. One being that Mexicans were considered white. This is because when the border was redrawn, Mexico was promised that those now living in the US would be treated as full citizens, and you needed to be white to be a citizen. And those people and their descendants were citizens, as well as anyone born here in the US. The arguments that were used to keep the undesirable races out were that they weren't white. That argument couldn't be made against Mexicans, so they had to find other ways to other them. Mexicans were likened to indigenous people and blacks, calling them backward, lazy, hypersexual, criminal, and reproducing so quickly that they could take over the country. Basically using language used against black, indigenous, Chinese, and Irish over the years, but against Mexicans instead. This language led people to further discriminate against Mexicans. By 1930, it became almost impossible for people to enter the US from Mexico. Between being described as people who were taking advantage of welfare systems and the Great Depression, many Mexicans and Mexican Americans started to listen to those suggestions that they move back to Mexico. I say back because many who ended up in Mexico had never been to the country. From 1929 through 1934, thousands of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were repatriated, coerced into emigrating, and deported to Mexico, with cooperation from the Mexican government. The difference between these three terms is important. Repatriation is when someone voluntarily goes back to their home country. Often this happens when refugees are able to return home. Coerced emigration is persuading or forcing someone to emigrate to a country. Deportation is when a person is expelled from a country. The problem is, as I mentioned earlier, there were legal US-born citizens who were leaving with their families. They were under the impression that since they were US citizens, they could come back to the US with no problem. They could re-enter the US if they had documents proving they were born in the US, as well as a birth certificate. Many didn't have this paperwork, so going back to their country of their birth was going to be hard. By now, much of this probably sounds familiar. So much of what was happening during the 20s and 30s continues on today, especially in regards to defining who is white and who belongs in the US. Thanks to segregation around the country, not just in the South, many Black people found it easier to simply form their own communities, whether it be within existing cities or establishing new towns, to live in so they could run businesses, be doctors, lawyers, and teachers, watch movies, go to bars, and generally live their lives away from the racism found in white populations. But these communities were able to shield them for only so long because xenophobia and racism didn't go away just because they tried to take themselves out of the daily lives of white people. Probably the most prominent example of all of this is the Greenwood Massacre, also known as the Tulsa Massacre. By 1900, free blacks in the Tulsa, Oklahoma area had started to settle in the part of town north of the Frisco Railroad tracks. They were able to establish businesses serving the black community that were so successful that the area was visited by Booker T. Washington in 1905. He suggested to the residents that they organize and establish a community, building on their industrial capacity, citing a similar area in Tuskegee as an example. The next year, the Greenwood community was established. One of the important aspects of Greenwood was their ability to exist without needing to interact with the white community around them. Their main street, Greenwood Avenue, was one of the few streets in Tulsa that did not cross through both black and white parts of town. Along Greenwood Avenue, the commercial district was established, with many buildings built from brick, including grocery stores, libraries, banks, and offices. Over time, Greenwood became known as Black Wall Street because of the commercial success the businesses there were experiencing. This success was important for its residents. While not everyone who lived there also worked there, the businesses gave the residents support that they didn't have out in segregated America. In Greenwood, they had doctors, lawyers, dentists, teachers who were black and not only weren't racist, but understood them and their experiences. They were able to grow a strong middle and upper class community that wouldn't have been possible in white America. Places like Greenwood showed that black people could be successful when they didn't have to fight against discrimination and racism. But that success came with resentment from the white residents of Tulsa. Over time, the district grew in population and size. Its borders started to come in contact with more and more of Tulsa. More residents started working in Tulsa, and white Tulsans grew resentful of the wealth that the Greenwood residents were amassing. All they needed was an excuse, and they would move against Black Wall Street. Memorial Day weekend, 1921, provided that excuse. A 19-year-old shoeshiner was accused of assaulting a 21-year-old female elevator operator. It could have been something as innocent as accidentally bumping into her, but what actually happened is unknown and doesn't matter in the end. He was arrested, and news of his arrest spread. Soon, hundreds of white men were surrounding the jail. News of that reached Greenwood, and 75 black men, some of whom were armed, went to the jail to protect the young man. There was a clash between the groups, and shots were fired. The black men retreated to Greenwood, and the white rioters followed. Despite efforts from residents, including veterans from World War I, Greenwood was looted and destroyed, both from the ground and from the air, with a few planes used to firebomb the neighborhood. Around 10,000 residents were homeless. $1.5 million in damages was done, and somewhere between 75 and 300 people were killed, and over 800 were wounded. It wasn't until 1996 that a study was commissioned by the Oklahoma government to study the massacre. 5 years later, they reported that the city had conspired with the mob and that survivors and their descendants be given reparations. The state also established scholarships for the descendants of survivors, passed legislation to encourage the continued redevelopment of the neighborhood, and established a park as a memorial to the victims. In 2001, there were still 118 survivors of the riot alive. Starting in 1997, searches for mass graves of the victims began. The remains of more than 20 suspected victims have been located. The HBO series Watchmen centers on the massacre, starting the series during the riots. Some point to Greenwood as an example of what happens when black people become successful. Another neighborhood where blacks moved to en masse in the early 1900s was Harlem in New York City. The population that moved to Harlem included people who were themselves enslaved in their lifetime through their grandchildren who had been born free. Harlem was just one of many places in the North where blacks moved to during what is called the Great Migration. Originally, Harlem had been established as a suburb for middle and upper middle class whites. But by the late 1800s, it started attracting immigrants and blacks from the South, so the whites moved out. By the early 1900s, the borough had become predominantly black, but still middle class. Near the end of World War I, the Harlem Renaissance was starting. The Harlem Renaissance was a time of African American art flourishing in all forms: music, fashion, art, literature, and theater. There was also success in politics and academia as well. It was a time where black people were able to express themselves through their chosen art form and not find success just in the black community, but in mainstream U.S. culture. It was during the Harlem Renaissance that jazz got its start. Artists like Jelly Roll Morton, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Adelaide Hall laid down the foundations upon which generations of artists and composers have continued to build upon. Jazz quickly became popular across the country, including among white people. It was possibly the first time something that came so clearly from black culture was appreciated by white audiences. It even started to influence white writers who would use the themes in jazz music in their own work. Jazz quickly made its way to the still developing form musical theater. One of the most successful all-black Broadway shows was Shuffle Along, which featured music and lyrics by Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle, composers and musicians who were part of laying the foundations of jazz. The plot largely drew on the writers, Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles' play, which was based in characters they had developed for years in vaudeville theaters. The show drew audiences of all races repeatedly, making it one of the most successful shows of its time. It even caused a massive traffic jam early in its run because of the amount of people heading to the theater. It was written and performed by African Americans, something that hadn't been seen in over a decade. Its mixture of minstrel show vaudeville and jazz appealed to both black and white audiences, giving them something they could share. The problem is that while much of the works created during the Harlem Renaissance were made by blacks, the popularity among mainstream U.S. culture led to whites appropriating aspects that they could and denying credit to creators where they could. Jazz is sadly a prominent example of this. Jazz has its roots in African American culture and community, but by the 30s, white composers and musicians were forming bands and creating new music without any acknowledgement from the culture they were appropriating it from. Cultural appropriation has been just as devastating to the black community as physical attacks. By appropriating elements of black culture, the roots and success of those elements are erased and disconnected from the people and the culture that created them, further empowering mainstream white U.S. culture. Physically taking out where successful black communities are halts progress. Claiming successful aspects of black culture as white halts progress. This is part of why recognizing cultural appropriation is important. Recognizing and acknowledging where aspects of culture come from restores the roots and the initial successful foundations, giving people today the chance to pick up where others left off and respecting the original cultures and people that created these elements. Throughout the history of the United States, gender hierarchies have existed. Sometimes those hierarchies have been enforced through legal actions. Sometimes they've been enforced through societal actions. No matter how the hierarchies and divisions are enforced, people have fought back against the discrimination, sexism, and genderism that those actions support. Since the founding of our nation, gender inequality and sexism has been written into the laws that govern the country and influence and shape society. I mean, look at the Constitution. All men are created equal. While Thomas Jefferson mostly meant men as a shortened version of humans, it also meant just men and males. And despite some women being educated and calling Jefferson out on that, including Angelica Schuyler Church, Alexander Hamilton's sister-in-law, who did so to his face, women of all races had little to no legal rights as the U.S. expanded westward. Granted, even white men's rights were dependent on meeting certain criteria, including owning land. And while women had no legal rights according to the laws of the U.S. government, white women were either born into citizenship or were able to become citizens, unlike indigenous, Mexican, and free black women. But even they had more rights than the women who were enslaved and treated as property, not people. Yet, when it came to gender roles, they were heavily dependent on class and geography. It was not unheard of for women to work a farm alongside her husband, caring for animals, plowing, planting, and harvesting crops, and chopping wood, in addition to caring for children, cooking, and cleaning. And that's just white women. Many indigenous tribes had much less strict roles for genders. While females tended to be the caretakers of children and in charge of cooking and cleaning, males could also take on those roles if they felt more suited to those roles, and females could be and were warriors, hunters, and leaders. They acknowledged that gender was not a binary that needed to be strictly enforced. Even colors we associate with gender are a relatively new construction. Before they were swapped in the early 1900s, pink was a boy's color and blue was a girl's color. But as technology advanced and our society grew, options for men and males kept growing, while women and females were expected to stay within the boundaries that were set decades earlier. It was expected that after marriage, women would give up any career they had in order to stay home and care for her husband, the house, and their eventual children. Even as college educations became more accessible and women were allowed to attend, it was expected that if they got married while pursuing a degree, they would end their studies no matter where they were in the course of that degree. First-wave feminism is generally said to have started in July 1848 at Seneca Falls. The Women's Rights Convention, more commonly referred to as the Seneca Falls Convention, was a 2-day convention focused on organizing to fight the rights of women to be equal to men. Ultimately, these women became known as suffragettes who fought for women's equality. This came from their goal, suffrage for women, the right of women to vote. This movement was predominantly a white movement, explicitly excluding black women from the movement. In 1920, their primary goal of guaranteeing white women the right to vote was met, thus largely ending the movement, despite numerous legal, social, and religious ways that women remained oppressed. It's not that suffragettes were unaware of all of those other oppressions and that women who were not white had additional oppressions to deal with. A number of people involved in first-wave feminism, both male and female, were also abolitionists who supported and worked toward the abolishment of slavery. But it was thought that by gaining the right to vote, many of these inequalities could be addressed. While white women were now able not just to vote, but to run for positions, they did start to gain some influence, but not enough to really make any changes. At least for a while. But it was a start. The eugenics movement began in the 1880s, after Sir Francis Galton coined the term, giving more power to the belief that having a disability meant you were a lesser human being. The movement came to a peak in the early 20th century. As your reading pointed out, eugenics came about as the U.S. population was becoming more ethnically diverse as blacks were free and spreading out across the country, and more people were immigrating to the U.S. from farther into Europe than before, and from China and Japan, all of which we've already talked about. Eugenics focused not only on regulating the bodies of people with disabilities, but of, quote, racial and ethnic variations, minority sexual orientation, behavioral deviance, criminality, aspects of gender difference, chronic illness, and even atypical temperaments, end quote. And these were all targets for elimination by eugenicists. While there were some laws put in place in states, for people with disabilities, eugenics was more of a medical and social barrier. As far as I can find, the U.S. government never put any eugenics laws in place. But many states enacted laws regarding marriage and compulsory sterilization. Now, these laws often applied to those with developmental disabilities, often called imbecilic or feeble-minded at the time. Both marriage laws passed with eugenic ideals and compulsory sterilization laws not only governed people with disabilities, but also races and ethnicities. People who were deemed unfit to procreate were often sterilized without their knowledge or consent. This was seen as a way to control those populations. It was not uncommon for Indigenous, Black, and Latina women to give birth and unknowingly be sterilized before going home through the 1980s. The farther you go back, the longer the list of ethnicities that were targeted becomes. People of all genders were also sterilized without their consent and or knowledge when incarcerated because criminality was a trait that eugenicists wanted to eradicate. They thought criminality was more of a biological thing than the discrepancies between races and classes. And eugenics wasn't just upheld by whites, but some prominent blacks, including W.E.B. Du Bois, supported eugenics to improve the overall status of their race as well. It is a sad period in U.S. history. By now, I'm sure a lot of what the eugenics movement was about sounds familiar. The reason it sounds familiar is the reason why eugenics quickly fell out of favor as the extreme lengths that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis took the practice to were known. Their combination of xenophobia, nationalism, ethnocentrism, and eugenics went farther than anyone had taken it in history up to that point or since. One thing that is often overlooked that your reading did address is that the Nazis started with the disabled of Germany, killing them as they worked to find the most efficient way to kill as many people as possible at one time. These efforts, known officially as Action T4, ultimately led to the creation of the gas chambers for their death camps. Also, Nazis went after more than just those with disabilities and Jews, going after LGBTQIA+ people after the disabled, but before Jews. Yet eugenics still has a presence in our society. People find out that their child is likely to have a disability and have an abortion. These are not conditions that would mean the child would likely die soon after being born. These are disabilities that people live full and happy lives with, including Down syndrome, but the parents see it as something they don't want to put their child through. There are fears that our advancements in genetics will lead to a new resurgence of eugenics, with parents altering their unborn children, eradicating conditions considered disabilities, like deafness and blindness, before birth. One of Star Trek's most legendary villains, Khan Noonien Singh, was the product of eugenics. In the fictional past of Star Trek, eugenics was used to create humans with superhuman levels of strength and intelligence who ended up working together to rule the world. It is a dark time in humanity's history and a warning against what selective breeding and genetic manipulation could produce. Yes, that is fictional, but just because it's fiction doesn't mean it has no point or message. When motion pictures became a popular form of entertainment, they also encoded the culture of the time, just like they do today. But in the early 20th century, there was a lot more xenophobia and rampant racism than there is today, believe it or not. One of the problematic aspects of film came from the practices of representing races in live entertainment. Long before film was invented, white people used makeup and costumes to represent other racial groups based on stereotypes so they could reinforce white superiority. These practices are known as blackface, redface, yellowface, and brownface, depending on the race or ethnicity being portrayed. Unfortunately, these practices made the transition from stage to film and later television. These practices spread and reinforced stereotypes about the populations, furthering discrimination and oppression. Blackface is the most common example of this practice. It was very common on the stage, with actors using burnt cork to blacken their faces and wigs to hide their hair. There were even black actors who performed in blackface, and as long as they were in blackface, they were allowed to perform alongside white actors because the audience assumed they were white too. Sometimes even the white actors didn't know they were performing with a black actor until they went to take off all their makeup. Burt Williams is possibly the most successful black actor who performed in blackface. He performed with another black actor, George Walker, as a duo on stage, playing the stereotypes of black people at the time, but successfully portraying them to white audiences. Their use of blackface makeup, even though they were black already, allowed them to continue to work. Unfortunately, blackface is a big part of early film. One of the earliest films ever, The Birth of a Nation, featured blackface and was white supremacist propaganda. It is full of very negative stereotypes against blacks, including that black men are mostly out to rape and kill white people. The first film to include sound, The Jazz Singer, featured Al Jolson in blackface, and that was far from Jolson's only time performing in blackface, either on or off screen. The way blackface makeup relied on very dark skin, overdrawn and pink lips became commonplace when portraying Black people in other parts of popular culture. Figures, dolls, advertisements, cartoons, and comics all used this visual instead of something more realistic. Over time, Black actors started to make their way into film, and the practice of blackface was seen as the racist practice that it was and was largely abandoned, with a few exceptions for making a point. The ending of blackface slowly made its way into removing harmful portrayals from other parts of popular culture too, like changing mascots of various brands from Black stereotypes, like Mrs. Butterworth, who was literally made into the bottle, thus no longer making them commodities to be bought and sold. Sadly, this hasn't applied as thoroughly to other groups. Redface is the practice of using actors other than Indigenous actors to portray Indigenous people in very stereotypical ways. Back then, people who were Greek, Italian, or otherwise looked more like Indigenous Americans were cast in those roles, which were written very flatly and reduced Native culture to this caricature of itself, instead of even hinting at the diverse cultures that existed. That is, when they didn't just put white actors in redface. Redface continued to be used, especially in Westerns, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even still gets used today. One prominent example of this is the actor Iron Eyes Cody. Cody was an American actor born to Italian parents who commonly played Native roles in films. He began to live as if he were actually Indigenous, embracing actual culture and lifestyle to the point where he self-identified as Indigenous in real life. He even worked to give more accurate portrayals when acting. He became known as the Crying Indian because of his role in an anti-litter PSA in the 1970s. I've included a link to the PSA below this video. In the recent film The Lone Ranger, Johnny Depp was cast as Tonto. And while Tonto is a caricature of Native Americans, he is still an Indigenous character that should have been played by an Indigenous actor who could have pointed out the combination of tribes' practice that were used in Depp's portrayal and possibly brought some authenticity to the role. That is a big reason why redface is problematic. Redface relies on stereotypes and a blatant disregard for the diversity of the Indigenous tribes of North America. Indigenous people were always shown shooting bows and arrows at white people, often from horseback, whooping and bare-chested. They would wear headdresses and headbands that were a mix of different tribes' traditions. When they spoke, it was either in gibberish or broken English. They would live in teepees in the plains and prairies of the western U.S. Reducing the diversity of the tribes to these simple stereotypes is reductive and harmful and insulting. Today, we still have very little real Indigenous representation in mainstream media. FX series Reservation Dogs is a great example of a representation. The majority of the cast and crew are Indigenous people, and thus are able to accurately tell the stories of this group of young friends living on a reservation. But there aren't many Indigenous people in mainstream film and television industries right now, which is part of why there aren't a lot of their stories being told. There is a lot of representation and work by Indigenous artists done independently from mainstream film and television. But that media can be hard to access, even in today's highly connected world. Yellowface is another often overlooked practice that has pervaded film, television, and theater for decades. Instead of hiring Asian actors to play the roles, makeup was used so white actors could play the roles instead, as well as employing actors who looked like they could be Asian. And again, the roles leaned heavily on stereotypes that inaccurately portrayed Asian people. In 1977, the end of that season of Doctor Who featured the serial The Talons of Wang Xian. It featured actors in yellowface and stereotypes of Chinese people. The musical Miss Saigon debuted in 1989 and takes place in Vietnam and originally featured British actor Jonathan Pryce as a character who was Vietnamese and French. He was put into yellowface for the original run in London. When the show moved to New York, he was not allowed to continue in the role because of the use of yellowface. While the show had a steady stream of people buying tickets, some audiences said the plot was racist and misogynistic, playing on stereotypes of both Vietnam and women. Brownface refers, sadly, to a number of ethnicities, most notably Latine, Swana, and Indian populations. Like the others, brownface tends to be white actors using makeup to appear to be from Central and South America, Southwestern Asia, and North Africa, or the Indian subcontinent. It's not as common as blackface and redface, but it happened, and even recently happened. In the 1961 film West Side Story, not only was the actress who plays Maria white, as was the actress who played her on Broadway. But the actual Latina cast members, including legend Rita Moreno, were put in darker makeup to appear even more different, leaning into the stereotype that Puerto Ricans all have darker skin. The films Short Circuit and Short Circuit 2 featured white American actor Fisher Stevens in brownface as the Indian character Ben Javeri. These films came out in the mid-'80s. Stevens has recently said that at the time he did not realize the problem in taking the role, but does realize the problem and regrets saying yes to playing Indian for the role. In 2012, Pop Chips put Ashton Kutcher into brownface as a Bollywood producer for a commercial. More recently, The Simpsons were called out for their character of Apu Nahasapima Petalon, which was brownface through animation. Apu was voiced by white actor Hank Azaria and had a very stereotyped accent, 8 children, and ran a convenience store. It has led to a lot of recasting of voice actors of characters because they were white voice actors and voicing a character who is not, including Family Guy and other characters on The Simpsons. The eugenics movement also made use of film. People were encouraged through a number of channels to make sure they were partnering with someone who would also produce fit offspring. One of the more well-known examples of this is the silent movie The Black Stork. Also known as Are You Fit to Marry? It debuted in 1917 and advocates for eugenics, including infanticide of disabled infants and warning people against sexual promiscuity and race mixing. Even during this time of eugenics, the film was seen as extreme and not well received by critics and the public. Yet it continued to be shown into the 40s. The film is on YouTube if you want to watch it, but it is disturbing. So I will leave it up to you whether or not you want to watch it. In addition to the numerous films made for entertainment that have little to no problematic aspects to them, film was also used to document many things. From 1910 through 1920, the National Association of the Deaf, the NAD, made a series of films to preserve ASL at the time. These films were preserved by the NAD, and in 1965 were transferred to Gallaudet University's archives so they could be better preserved and made available to the public. The films are still available today at Gallaudet and include notable members of the deaf community of the time, including Edward Minor Gallaudet. They made these films because they feared that pure ASL was in danger of disappearing due to oralism gaining strength. They thought that the films could preserve the language for future generations. They were right that the film did preserve the language for future generations. One film called Preservation of the Sign Language features NAD President George Veditz signing a speech for the camera in 1913. Since ASL has no sound involved, the silent aspect of film at the time had no impact on the creation of the film. Preservation of the Sign Language was selected to be added to the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress in 2011. The film is also available on YouTube. I have included a link to it below this video. I recommend watching it even if you don't know ASL because it is an important piece of US history and gives us insight into ASL at the time.